Another year and another worry that Red Bull are going to dominate the Formula One season. We've seen their new car, and I have to admit, I'm a little bit concerned for the rest of the grid. Let's take a look. First things first, the renders we saw are not useless, but they hide a lot of details, so you can't really learn too much from them. But we do know the general shape of the car, the side pods, the engine cover, the front wing, is what Red Bull's going with, at least as an early spec, because we know this from the spy shots we saw from Silverstone a few days ago. So what we see in the studio is their early version of the car. It doesn't mean what they'll start the first race with, but it is their early version. The actual car that was on show at the event, I guess, was the one they ran in Silverstone, and that one has a lot more detail on it. So we'll try and look at that one as much as possible. Let's start with the side pods. From the renders, it honestly looks like there is no side pod entry at all. But from the real car, you can see there is a vertical slit. Now, some people believe this is the side pod entry, and others think maybe it's more of an S duct like we've seen on other cars. And actually, it's hard to know. Some people think maybe there's a higher side pod entry further up, a really, really tiny slit. There's a 3D render of the Red Bull car on their website that does show a small entry. But maybe that's just a red herring. The truth is we don't know at the minute, but it's very interesting for a few reasons. First of all, it's actually very similar to what Mercedes had at the beginning of last year and obviously the year before. They had this vertical side pod inlet because it fitted with their zero pod design. Red Bull do have side pods on this car, at least for now, but by having that vertical inlet, it actually potentially gives way more space for the undercut, which, as we know in this generation of cars, is really strong. It's what most teams are going for. They've also gone to what is now being called an overbite. I don't know if this is the technical term. Last year, they had an underbite, so they've had some surgery. This means that they had a lower flap extending from the side pod inlet out of the bottom or at the bottom of the intake. A lot of teams have now gone to this solution this year, but Red Bull have gone, actually, no, and now gone the opposite way. So you'll see that the side pod actually extends above now. It's got almost like a wing above it. And that's completely different to what most other teams are doing. Aston Martin have gone a different way. Ferrari have gone a different way. Mercedes have gone a different way. Then, much like Mercedes, Red Bull have also gone with a very large cannon-style cover. A really extreme version of what Mercedes had last year. The problem is Mercedes have gone away from this. So Mercedes had these big cannons last year on the engine cover. They don't this year. Whereas Red Bull didn't have extreme ones. This year, they are very extreme. It's meant to accelerate air, I think, over the beam wing and aid in diffuser performance. For whatever reason, Mercedes have gone away from it with their concept, whereas Red Bull have gone toward it, which is interesting. Now, we know how good Adrian Newey is, and we have joked or seen jokes online about maybe Red Bull bringing a zero-pod concept at testing. That would be incredible. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but I wonder if he saw the zero pod design on the Mercedes and thought, well, that's not going to work, but the vertical intake is interesting. Maybe we could adopt that. Or maybe these were designs he was already working on. It's just, pure coincidence. There is also some interesting things going on with the front wing. Last year, the nose cone attached to the second element of the front wing, leaving the front element detached to aid airflow underneath the car. This year, a lot of other teams have adopted that approach, including Mercedes, which last year was the opposite. But once again, Red Bull have gone the other way. With almost a duckbill looking front wing, this now extends down onto the first flap, but there does seem to be a panel on it suggesting that maybe it could be removed or replaced with something else. One important thing to note in this area is that Red Bull failed the front impact test a few times, which isn't abnormal for teams, but it does mean maybe they were pushing the limits here on some sort of design on their front wing. I actually think this is a dummy front wing, a basic version that isn't what we're actually going to see at Bahrain. I think we're going to see something interesting on this front wing at Bahrain. In fact, I actually suspect there'll be big changes across the board in Bahrain. I don't think we've seen any team show off their true full hand yet, because teams want to show or save as much as possible for as long as possible. I think the Red Bull's going to surprise a few people in Bahrain. And that's why I'm concerned. Red Bull didn't upgrade their car for the entirety of the second half of last season, and yet they were still comfortably the fastest car. They struggled in Singapore, and that's it. This means two things. One, they probably had updates planned for 2024, but just didn't bring them to the car because they didn't need to. They didn't need to spend that money. And two, it means they could start work on that 2024 car earlier, probably much earlier than other teams. This means that while this car is an evolution of last year's car, they've taken a lot of knowledge and put a lot of time into getting it together. And that should worry everyone. Of course, other teams could have made a bigger step than Red Bull. McLaren, probably not Mercedes or Ferrari, but it is possible. We don't know what's underneath these cars. So that gap could close rather than increase. And I hope that is the case. But based on what we've seen in the last few years, Adrian Newey's ahead of the curve. He isn't behind it. And I genuinely don't see what any other team could do to bridge that gap at the minute based on what I've seen, because the gap was already so big. The only hope that we have is that Red Bull gets something wrong with their new car. After taking such an aggressive approach, they might get something wrong. But I don't really see that either. Could Red Bull dominate in 2024 again? I hope not, but I do fear that they will. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.